There is a curious detail in the Bible that many people have never noticed. Some of the greatest revelations about God did not happen in temples. They did not happen in palaces, and they were not given to kings or famous prophets. Happened in the desert. Far from the cities. Far from the crowds. Far from anything that looked like hope. And one of these revelations happened to a woman that almost no one would expect. She was not a queen. She was not a leader. She was not an Israelite. In fact, she was an Egyptian slave, a woman used in the middle of a family conflict. Rejected. Humiliated. And at a certain moment in her life, she was forced to flee alone into the desert, without protection, without a destination, without knowing if she would survive. But it was exactly there, in the most unlikely place, that something extraordinary happened. God appeared, not to Abraham, not to a prophet, but to a wounded woman, invisible in the eyes of people. And in that unexpected encounter, she declared something that would echo through the centuries. You are the God who sees me. This is the story of Hagar, a story that crosses generations, a story filled with pain, difficult choices, and divine promises. But it is also a story that reveals something deep about the character of God, because the Bible shows that the Lord does not only see kings, he sees servants. He does not only see the strong, he sees the broken, and he does not reveal himself only in places of glory. Sometimes he reveals himself in the middle of the desert. Today, we are going to walk through this story, step by step. We will understand the context of that time, the decisions that led Hagar to the desert, and the surprising moment when God completely changed the course of her life. And maybe, by the end of this journey, you will discover something powerful. That the God who found Hagar in the desert still finds people today, long before Hagar fled into the desert, long before a well appeared before desperate eyes. This story begins with a promise that seemed impossible. To understand what happened to Hagar, we first need to look at the house where she lived, the house of a man named Abraham. Abraham was not an ordinary man. He was known among the peoples of the region as a clan leader, a nomadic patriarch who traveled with his family, his flocks, and his servants through the lands of Canaan, a region located between the Mediterranean Sea and the dry deserts of the Middle East. But what truly made Abraham different was something invisible to human eyes. He had received a promise from God. The promise was extraordinary. God had told him that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. A promise of a nation, a promise of a future, a promise of blessing for all the families of the earth. But there was a detail, a painful detail. Abraham and his wife Sarah had no children. And in that time, this was not only a personal sadness, it was something much deeper. In the culture of the ancient Middle East, having children was not just a desire. It was the way to preserve the family name, guarantee inheritance, and ensure the continuation of the clan. Children meant future. Without children, there was no legacy. And Sarah was barren. The book of Genesis 11:30 records this in a direct and silent way. Sarah was barren. She had no children. A short sentence, but behind it were years of frustrated hope, years of waiting, years of silence, because time kept passing, and in the ancient world, time was relentless for a woman who longed to be a mother. When God first called Abraham, his name was still Abram, and Sarah was still called Sarai. They left their homeland, Ur of the Chaldeans, and traveled hundreds of miles, obeying a voice that few people could understand. They walked by faith. They crossed deserts. Mountains. Plains. They faced famine. At one point, they temporarily moved to Egypt during a great shortage of food in the land of Canaan. And it was exactly during that time in Egypt that something happened that would later completely change the destiny of another woman. A young Egyptian woman named Hagar entered Abraham's household. The book of Genesis 12 tells us that when Abraham was in Egypt, Pharaoh gave him many gifts. Among these gifts were sheep, cattle, male servants, female servants, and many other riches. Among those female servants was most likely Hagar, a young Egyptian woman, a foreigner. Someone who did not choose to be part of that story. At that time, servants were considered part of the household structure of the clan. They worked, served, and they belonged to the house of their masters. Imagine, for a moment, what that meant. Imagine being taken from one place to another, without anyone asking what you wanted, without choice, without a voice, without a future of your own. That was the reality for many people in the ancient world. And that was probably the reality of Hagar. She now lived in the house of Sarai, the wife of Abram, a house that seemed blessed. Flocks. Servants. Riches. Respect among the peoples of the region. But inside that house there was a silent pain, the pain of a promise that had not yet been fulfilled. The years kept passing, and the promise of God seemed distant. Abram was getting older, Sarai as well, and every new year made the promise even harder to imagine. Because there is something deeply human about waiting. Waiting can strengthen faith. It can also reveal our weaknesses. How many times does a divine promise seem clear at the beginning, but become difficult to understand as time passes? That was the tension inside Abraham's tent. On one side, the promise of God. On the other, the reality of barrenness. On one side, hope. On the other, silence. And it was in this environment of waiting and frustration that Sarai began to think of a solution. A solution that was common in that culture. But one that carried deep consequences. In the ancient world, especially among the peoples of Mesopotamia and Canaan. There was a socially accepted practice. When a wife could not have children, the wife could give her servant to her husband to bear a child in her place. Child born from that union would legally be considered the child of the wife. It was a human attempt to solve a problem that seemed impossible. Perhaps Sarai thought she was helping God fulfill his promise. Perhaps she was tired of waiting. Perhaps the pain of infertility had become too heavy to carry alone. The Bible does not describe all the thoughts of Sarai, but it records her decision. And that decision would change Hagar's life forever. In Genesis chapter 16, Sarai says to Abram, since the Lord has prevented me from having children, go to my servant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. It was a culturally acceptable solution. But emotionally complex. Because even though it was common in that society, that did not mean it was easy. Not for Sarai, not for Hagar. And not for the story that was about to unfold. And so, quietly, a decision made inside a tent in Canaan began to set in motion a chain of events that would lead a pregnant woman alone into the middle of the desert. But before the desert appears in the story, something happens inside that house. Something changes. And that moment marks the beginning of a conflict that no one there imagined would become so deep. It is exactly here that the story takes its next step. And that step begins with a pregnancy. Inside Abraham's tents, life followed the rhythm of the seasons. Flocks needed to be taken to new pastures. Servants organized the camp. Wells were dug. Negotiations with neighboring peoples took place. Externally, Abraham's household looked prosperous. But inside Sarai's tent there was a silence that only she understood. Silence of the promise that had not yet been fulfilled. The years had passed since God had promised Abraham an uncountable lineage. And still no child had been born. In that culture, barrenness was not only a physical condition. It was a social mark, often seen as shame. A woman without children frequently carried the weight of silent looks, unspoken questions, and broken expectations. Sarah had waited a long time, waited for years, but a moment came when she decided to act. Genesis chapter 16 presents us with a conversation that would completely change the destiny of that household. Sarai said to Abram, since the Lord has prevented me from having children, go to my servant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Genesis 16:2. It was a solution that existed within the culture of the ancient East. Legal texts found in ancient cities of Mesopotamia show that when a wife was barren, she could offer her servant to her husband to produce an heir. The child born from that union would legally be considered part of the main family. Asterisk, in other words, this did not seem strange to that society. Asterisk, but something can be culturally common and still deeply painful. Asterisk, imagine the weight of that decision. Asterisk for Sarai, it meant admitting that perhaps she would never be the mother of the child of promise. Asterisk. For Abram, it meant accepting a path that had not been directly instructed by God. Asterisk. And for Hagar, a young Egyptian servant, it meant something even more complex. Asterisk. Because no one asks the opinion of a servant in that culture. Asterisk, she simply obeyed. Hagar did not choose to be part of that plan. She did not ask to carry that responsibility. Asterisk, but suddenly she was placed at the center of a divine promise. The biblical text says something simple but powerful. Abram, listen to the voice of Sarai. Genesis 16:2. And so, after 10 years living in the land of Canaan, Sarai gave her Egyptian servant Hagar to Abram as a secondary wife. This detail is important. Hagar did not become the primary wife. Asterisk, she was still a servant, but now she had a new role inside the household, to bear a child, an heir. Perhaps in that moment, everyone believed they were solving the problem. Asterisk, perhaps they believed they were helping God's promise come to pass. Asterisk, but there is a silent lesson in this story. Asterisk, sometimes, when we try to accelerate the plans of God, we create conflicts we never imagined. Asterisk, and that is exactly what happened. Asterisk, because something unexpected happened soon after. Asterisk, Hagar became pregnant. Asterisk, and with that pregnancy, something inside that household began to change. Asterisk, something no one had predicted. Asterisk, Genesis 16:4 says, he went into Hagar, and she conceived. A short sentence, but filled with consequences. Because in that moment, Hagar began to carry inside her something Sarai had desired for years, life, and that would change the dynamic between those two women. For Hagar, perhaps this was the first time in her life that she felt she had value. She now carried the child of the patriarch, the heir of Abraham, the son who might fulfill the promise. Perhaps for the first time she was no longer just an invisible servant. But something began to happen inside her heart. The biblical text says, when she saw that she had conceived, she began to despise her mistress. Genesis 16:4. This is a deeply human detail. Hagar had spent her entire life as a servant. Now, for the first time, she had something Sarai did not have. A pregnancy, a child, possible future God, and that changed her posture. Perhaps without realizing it, perhaps as a natural reaction after years of submission. But Sarai noticed, and it deeply wounded her heart. The tension inside that house began to grow. The plan that once seemed simple began to reveal its emotional consequences, because the pain of infertility was now being remembered. Every single day, not through words, but through a growing belly. Then Sarai turned against Abram. She said something that reveals the tension of the situation. May the wrong done to me be on you. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. Genesis 16:5. In other words, the plan she herself had suggested was now becoming an open wound. Abram answered directly, "Your servant is in your hands. Do to her whatever you think is best." Genesis 16:6. And with that, Hagar returned to the position she had always had in that household. Servant. Without protection, without a voice, without authority. Then something began to happen. The biblical text uses a strong word. Sarai began to mistreat Hagar. We do not know exactly how. The Bible does not describe the details, but the pressure became unbearable. Imagine the situation. Hagar was pregnant, probably young, alone in a foreign land, and now living under constant hostility. Until a moment came when she made a desperate decision. She ran away. She left the camp. She left Abraham's household. She left the only structure she had ever known, and she began walking toward the desert. Alone. Pregnant. Without protection, without knowing exactly what would happen next. But what she did not know yet was that the desert would not be only a place of escape. It would become the setting of an encounter that would change her story forever. Hagar's pregnancy was supposed to solve a problem inside Abraham's household. But in reality, it created another, and it was not a small problem. It was a conflict that began to grow silently within the family itself. To understand the weight of this situation, we need to remember something important about the social structure of that time. In the ancient world, the hierarchy inside a household was very clear. At the top was the patriarch. In this case, Abraham. Right below him was the primary wife. Sarah. After her came the secondary wives, and below them, the male and female servants. For years, Hagar had occupied the lowest level of that structure. She was a servant, foreigner. An Egyptian, someone without status inside that house. But now something had changed. Hagar was pregnant, and not just pregnant. She carried the child of the patriarch. In a culture where lineage meant everything, this was enormous. Perhaps for the first time in her life, Hagar felt that she had a position. Perhaps for the first time, she realized that her body carried something that could change her destiny. But this new reality also created tension, because Sarah was being reminded every day of something she had long desired. And could not have. Hagar's belly was growing, and every passing day made that reality impossible to ignore. The pain of infertility did not disappear. In fact, it became even more visible. And that deeply wounded Sarah. The tension reached an unbearable point. And finally Hagar fled. She ran into the desert. But the God of Abraham had not lost sight of her. Because in that desert something extraordinary would happen. God would meet her there. The desert between Canaan and Egypt was not a place for someone to walk alone. Especially not a pregnant woman. The land was dry. The sun burned the ground. Water was rare. Travelers normally moved in caravans. But Hagar walked alone. Perhaps trying to return to Egypt. Perhaps simply trying to escape the pain she had left behind. The Bible tells us that she arrived near a spring in the wilderness. Genesis 16:7 says, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness on the road to Shur. Notice something important. The text does not say that Hagar found God. It says that God found her. She was not looking for a spiritual encounter. She was just trying to survive. But God met her in the desert, and then the angel spoke. He called her by name. Hagar, servant of Sra, where have you come from, and where are you going? This question revealed something powerful. God knew her. He knew her story, but he invited her to speak, and Hagar answered honestly, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. Then the angel of the Lord said something unexpected. Return to your mistress and submit to her. But immediately after that command came a promise. A promise that would change her future. I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they cannot be counted. Then the angel continued, you are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your suffering. The name Ishmael means God hears. Every time she called that boy by name, she would remember that God had listened to her pain. But the most extraordinary moment came next. Hagar realized something. She had encountered God himself, and she responded with a declaration that would echo through the centuries. Genesis 16-13 says, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. In Hebrew, this name is El-Roi, the God who sees. Hagar was a servant, a foreigner. Someone invisible in the eyes of society. But God saw her. He saw her suffering. He saw her escape. He saw her tears in the desert. And because of that encounter, she returned with hope. Years later, Hagar would face the desert again. But once more, God would intervene. He would open her eyes to see a well of water, and her son Ishmael would live. Hagar's story carries a powerful message. The God of the Bible does not only see kings and prophets, he sees the forgotten. He sees the broken. He sees the ones who cry when no one else is watching. And sometimes the desert is not the end of the story. Sometimes the desert is the place where we discover that God was there all along. He sees, he hears, and he still finds people today. The God who found Hagar in the desert. Is still the God who sees you.